There's a moment, quiet, almost invisible, when an empath woman begins to change the way she relates to the world. It doesn't happen overnight, and it rarely comes from a place of anger. It comes from exhaustion, from pattern recognition, from the slow realization that being endlessly available emotionally has a cost, and eventually that cost becomes too high. For most of her life, her identity has been rooted in how deeply she can feel and how much she can give. She reads between the lines. She notices the shift in tone, the hesitation in someone's voice, the unspoken tension in a room. And because she can feel it, she believes almost instinctively that it's her responsibility to respond to it, to soothe it, to fix it. That's where the trap begins. Because over time, this constant outward focus creates an imbalance. She becomes hyper-aware of others but disconnected from herself. Her emotional energy is always flowing outward, rarely inward, and the people around her, whether intentionally or not, begin to rely on that. They expect her patience. They depend on her understanding. They assume her forgiveness is permanent, but awareness changes everything. At some point, she starts to notice a pattern. She sees that the same people who receive her empathy don't necessarily return it, that her kindness is often met with convenience, not respect, that her willingness to understand others is rarely matched by others trying to understand her. And once she sees that, clearly once she truly understands it, something shifts. This is where emotional sovereignty begins. It's important to understand she doesn't become cold. That's the misconception. People think when an empath stops caring, they've hardened. But what's actually happening is far more precise. She's becoming selective. She's learning the difference between compassion and self-abandonment. And that distinction is everything. Before, she would stay in conversations that drain her because she didn't want to hurt someone's feelings. Now she recognizes that constantly sacrificing her own well-being to preserve someone else's comfort is not kindness, it's a lack of boundaries. And boundaries are not barriers. They are clarity, so she begins to choose. She chooses when to engage and when to step back. She chooses which relationships deserve depth and which ones remain surface level. She stops offering explanations to people who have shown no capacity to understand. And most importantly, she stops volunteering her emotional energy to situations where it is neither valued nor reciprocated. This is not a reaction, it's a recalibration. There's a psychological shift that happens here that most people don't recognize. When someone has been consistently available, their absence creates a vacuum. The people around her begin to feel it immediately. The same empathy that was once taken for granted is now missing, and suddenly they're aware of how much they depended on it. But she doesn't respond the way she used to, because now her internal reference point has changed. She's no longer measuring her worth by how much she can give. She's measuring it by how well she can maintain alignment with herself. That's a completely different framework. And once that framework is in place, it's very difficult to go back. Philosophically, this is the transition from external validation to internal authority. She's no longer asking, how can I be what they need? She's asking, is this aligned with who I am? That question alone filters out a significant portion of what used to occupy her time and energy. And here's where it becomes powerful. Because when an empath woman operates from emotional sovereignty, her presence changes. It becomes grounded, intentional. There's no urgency to prove herself, no need to chase connection, no compulsion to fix what isn't hers to fix. She still feels deeply, but now that depth is directed with precision, not obligation. People often misinterpret this stage. They call it distance. They call it indifference, but it's neither. It's discipline. It's the result of someone who has studied their own patterns and decided to break them. And breaking that pattern requires something most people avoid: discomfort. It means disappointing people who were used to her constant availability. It means stepping back from dynamics that once defined her identity. It means tolerating the silence that follows when she no longer fills every emotional gap in a relationship. But that silence is necessary because it creates space, and in that space, she reconnects with herself. That's the part most people overlook. This isn't just about withdrawing from others. It's about returning to self. She begins to notice what she actually feels, separate from everyone else, what she actually wants, what she actually needs. And those answers are often very different from the role she's been playing for years. So when she stops carrying in the way, she used to, it's not a loss, it's a refinement. It's the evolution of empathy from something reactive into something intentional. She hasn't lost her ability to care. She's just stopped giving it away indiscriminately. And once that shift is made, it doesn't reverse, because she has seen the difference between being needed and being respected, between being available and being valued. And once you understand that difference at a deep level, you don't negotiate with it anymore. You honor it. And that's the moment everything changes, when she realizes that protecting her energy isn't selfish, it's the standard. There's a noticeable shift that follows emotional sovereignty, and it often catches people off guard. Because when an empath woman begins to reclaim her energy, the first thing that changes isn't her presence, it's her communication. Or more accurately, the lack of it. She used to explain everything. Not just what she felt, but why she felt it. She would walk people through her intentions, her reasoning, her perspective carefully, patiently, because she believed that clarity could fix disconnection. That if she just found the right words, the right tone, the right moment, the other person would finally understand. And understanding in her mind would lead to resolution. But over time, she begins to recognize a hard truth. Not everyone misunderstands you by accident. Some people understand exactly what you're saying, they just benefit more from pretending they don't. That realization changes the entire strategy, because explanation requires two things: honesty from the speaker and openness from the listener. And when one of those is missing, the entire process becomes a loop. She explains, they deflect. She clarifies, they distort. She tries again, and nothing fundamentally changes. The conversation becomes less about resolution and more about emotional expenditure. And eventually, she sees it for what it is: an inefficient use of her energy. This is where silence begins to replace explanation. Now, silence is often misunderstood. People interpret it as avoidance or even passive aggression. But in this context, it's neither. It's a decision. A deliberate withdrawal from conversations that have proven to be unproductive. She's no longer engaging in dialogue where the outcome has already been demonstrated. That's a form of intelligence. Because once you identify a pattern, continuing to participate in it without change isn't compassionate. Compliance, and she's no longer willing to comply with dynamics that diminish her. So instead of explaining, she observes. She listens more than she speaks. She pays attention to actions rather than words. And when something doesn't align, when someone's behavior contradicts their claims, she doesn't rush in to correct it. She doesn't initiate another long conversation to reconcile the inconsistency. She simply notes it, adjusts her expectations, and moves accordingly. That restraint is powerful, because explanation used to be her way of maintaining connection. Silence becomes her way of maintaining clarity. And here's where the psychological shift becomes even more pronounced. When she stops explaining, she also stops seeking validation for her perspective. She no longer needs the other person to agree in order to feel secure in what she knows. That internal confidence removes the urgency from her communication. She's not trying to win the conversation anymore. She's trying to understand the reality of the situation and then act in alignment with that reality. For people who were used to her explaining, this change is disorienting. They may push for a reaction. They may try to provoke a response because the absence of her usual engagement creates uncertainty. But she doesn't respond the way she used to, not because she has nothing to say, but because she has nothing to prove. And that's a critical distinction. Silence in this context is not the absence of thought, it's the presence of decision. She has decided that not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected, that not every accusation deserves a defense, that not every relationship warrants the same level of effort. And once those decisions are made, her communication naturally becomes more selective, more precise, more intentional. There's also a philosophical layer to this. Language is often used as a tool to shape perception. When she was constantly explaining, she was, in a sense, negotiating her reality with others trying to align their perception of her with her own. But now she understands that perception is not something you can control through repetition. People see what they're prepared to see. And no amount of explanation can force clarity onto someone who is committed to misunderstanding. So she stops trying, not out of defeat, but out of awareness. She recognizes that her time and energy are finite resources, and she allocates them accordingly. Conversations that lead to growth, mutual understanding, or genuine connection still receive her attention. But conversations that cycle through the same unresolved patterns are no longer entertained. This is where her silence becomes a boundary. It's not announced, it's not justified, it simply exists. And over time, that boundary reshapes her environment. The people who are capable of meeting her at that level will adjust. They'll engage with more honesty, more accountability, more respect. And the ones who can't, who relied on her constant explanations to maintain control or avoid responsibility, will gradually fall away. That's not a loss. That's a filtration process. Because when you remove the need to explain yourself to everyone, you also remove the pressure to maintain connections that aren't built on mutual understanding. What remains is more aligned, more stable, more real. And perhaps most importantly, she becomes more at peace. There's a quiet confidence that comes with this stage, a sense of stability that isn't dependent on how others interpret her. She knows what she meant. She knows what she did. And she's comfortable letting that be enough. That level of self-trust is not easily shaken. It changes how she moves through every interaction. There's less urgency, less reactivity, less emotional volatility. She's not pulled into every disagreement or distracted by every misinterpretation. She remains centered because her sense of clarity is internally generated. And once that internal clarity is established, external noise loses its influence. So when an empath woman stops explaining, it's not because she's disengaged from the world. It's because she's no longer negotiating with it. She has refined her communication down to what is necessary, what is meaningful, and what is deserved. Everything else is silence. And that silence speaks with more authority than words ever could. Because at some point you realize that the people who truly understand you never needed. The explanation in the first place, and the ones who demanded it were never really listening. After the shift into silence, something even more profound begins to take shape. It's less visible, less performative, but far more consequential. This is where detachment enters not as a defense mechanism, but as a form of clarity. Now, detachment is often misunderstood. People hear that word and immediately associate it with indifference, emotional shutdown, or a kind of cold withdrawal from life. But that's not what's happening here. What's happening is far more precise. She's not detaching from feeling, she's detaching from over-identifying with what she feels, and more importantly, from what other people feel asterisk. For most of her life, the boundary between her emotions and the emotions of others was blurred. She didn't just observe people's pain, she absorbed it. She didn't just notice tension, she carried it. And because of that, her reactions were often driven by a need to resolve discomfort. That didn't even originate within her. That creates a very specific kind of vulnerability, because if your internal state is constantly influenced by external emotions, then your sense of stability becomes dependent on the behavior of others. If they're calm, you're calm. If they're chaotic, you're pulled into that chaos. And over time, that dynamic becomes exhausting. Detachment disrupts that pattern. It introduces space between stimulus and response, between what she perceives and how she chooses to engage with it. And that space is where her power is restored. Instead of immediately reacting to someone's mood, she observes it. Instead of internalizing someone's frustration, she evaluates it. She begins to ask a different set of questions. Is this mine to carry? Is this something I can influence? Is this even aligned with my responsibility? And more often than not, the answer is no. That no is important because it allows her to remain present without becoming entangled. She can still care, she can still understand, but she no longer feels compelled to merge with what she's experiencing. There's a separation now, a healthy, intentional separation. Psychologically, this is the difference between empathy and enmeshment. Empathy allows you to recognize and understand another person's emotional state. Enmeshment causes you to lose yourself within it. And for a long time, she operated in that second mode without realizing it. Detachment brings her back to the first. And once that distinction becomes clear, her perception sharpens. She starts to see people as they are, not as she hoped they would be. That's a critical turning point, because hope, when it's not grounded in evidence, can distort judgment. It can keep you invested in potential rather than reality. It can make you overlook patterns that are consistently showing you the truth. But detachment removes that distortion. It doesn't eliminate compassion, it refines it. She can still recognize someone's struggle, but she no longer uses that struggle as a justification for behavior that negatively impacts her. She no longer confuses understanding someone with excusing them. That's where her strength becomes undeniable. because now her decisions are based on observation, not projection. She's not filling in the gaps with assumptions about who someone could be. She's responding to who they've consistently shown themselves to be, and that changes everything. There's also a temporal element to this shift. Before, she was often focused on the past, on what someone had been through, or the future, on what they might become. Now, her focus is anchored in the present. What is this person doing right now? How are they showing up consistently? That present-focused awareness removes ambiguity. And without ambiguity, decision-making becomes simpler. This is where detachment evolves into discernment. She becomes highly selective, not just in who she allows into her life, but in how deeply she allows them in. Not everyone gets access to the same level of her attention, her vulnerability, or her energy. And that's not a judgment of others, it's a recognition of value. Because depth is not something you give away indiscriminately. It's something you invest where it's respected. And once she understands that, she stops negotiating her standards. Now, from the outside, this can look like distance. People who were used to having unrestricted access to her emotional world may interpret this as withdrawal. They may even accuse her of changing, as if consistency and self-sacrifice was the standard she was supposed to maintain. But she doesn't internalize that anymore, because she recognizes a fundamental truth. Growth often looks like rejection to those who benefited from your lack of boundaries. So she remains steady. She doesn't over-explain her detachment, just like she doesn't over-explain her silence. She simply lives in alignment with what she now understands. And that alignment creates a kind of internal stability that doesn't fluctuate based on external reactions. That stability is what makes her presence different. There's a calmness to it, a groundedness. She's not easily pulled into drama, not easily manipulated by emotional volatility, not easily convinced to abandon her perspective for the sake of temporary harmony. She values peace, but not at the cost of her clarity. And perhaps most importantly, she becomes comfortable with letting things end. That's a significant shift, because earlier she might have held on to try to repair, try to rebuild, try to restore what once was. But now, if something is no longer aligned, she allows it to conclude without resistance. Not because it doesn't matter, but because she understands that not everything is meant to continue. Some things are meant to reveal. And once they've revealed what they needed to reveal, holding on only delays the inevitable. So when an empath woman reaches this stage of detachment, she begins to feel a sense of detachment from the world around her. She hasn't lost her depth, she's mastered it. She's no longer controlled by what she feels, she's guided by what she understands. And that understanding allows her to move through the world with a level of precision that wasn't available to her before. She sees clearly, she chooses carefully, and she commits fully only where it's deserved. Because at some point, you stop asking how much you can tolerate and you start asking what you're no longer willing to accept. And then you arrive at the final stage of this transformation, the part that people feel the most, even if they don't fully understand it. Because after the shift into sovereignty, after the silence replaces explanation, and after detachment refines perception, what remains is absence. Not dramatic absence, not loud confrontational exits or emotional declarations, just absence, clean, quiet, and deliberate. This is where the empath woman does something that, for most of her life, would have felt unnatural. She stops, showing up where she is not valued. Now that sounds simple on the surface, but when you understand her history, how much of her identity was built around being present, then you can see that her sense of self is not just about her past, but about her present. Being reliable, being the one who stayed, you begin to realize how significant this shift actually is. Because before, her instinct was to remain, to endure discomfort, to give people time, second chances, third chances, sometimes unlimited chances. She believed in consistency and loyalty and the idea that if she just held the space long enough, things would improve. But absence requires a different kind of thinking. It requires her to accept that not all situations are meant to be repaired, that not all people are willing to grow, and more importantly, that her presence, no matter how supportive, how patient, how understanding, is not the variable that determines someone else's behavior. That realization is sobering, because it dismantles the belief that she can influence outcomes simply by caring more. It forces her to confront the limits of her role in other people's lives. And once she sees those limits clearly, continuing to overextend herself no longer feels like compassionate, feels like self-neglect. So she makes a decision, and it's not announced. There's no final conversation where she lays everything out, no detailed explanation of why she's stepping back. That phase has already passed. The silence and detachment have already done the work of revealing what needed to be seen. Now, she simply withdraws. She stops initiating contact. She stops maintaining dynamics that are one-sided. She stops filling the emotional gaps that others have come to rely on her to fill. And in doing so, she creates something that didn't exist before. A void. And that void is where the impact happens. Because when someone has been consistently present in your life emotionally, mentally, energetically, their absence is not neutral. It's noticeable. It disrupts the pattern. It removes a stabilizing force that people may not have even realized they depended on. This is why her absence becomes louder than anything she could have said. Words can be dismissed. Explanations can be argued with. But absence is undeniable. It doesn't engage. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't defend itself. It simply exists as a new reality. And that reality forces reflection. People begin to replay interactions, to reconsider moments they overlooked, to recognize the consistency she brought, the patience she offered, the understanding she extended often without acknowledgement. And in that recognition, there's usually a delayed appreciation. But here's the critical part. By the time that appreciation arrives, she has already moved on. Not in a reactive way, not out of spite or resentment, but because her internal process has already reached its conclusion. She didn't leave impulsively. She left after observation, after evaluation, after giving more than enough opportunity for alignment. So when she's gone, she's not halfway out. She's fully withdrawn. That finality is what makes it so impactful, because it contrasts sharply with who she used to be. The version of her that would have returned, reconsidered, re-engaged. That version operated on hope. This version operates on evidence, and evidence doesn't argue, it informs. There's also a deeper philosophical layer to this. Presence is often taken for granted because it's consistent. It becomes part of the environment, expected, assumed, almost. Invisible in its reliability. But when that presence is removed, it reveals its true value. Absence, in that sense, is a form of communication. It communicates boundaries without words. It communicates standards without explanation. It communicates a decision that has already been made internally without seeking external validation. And that kind of communication is difficult to ignore. Now, this doesn't mean her absence is intended to teach anyone a lesson. That's not the motivation. She's not withdrawing to provoke a reaction or to create a sense of loss. She's withdrawing because staying is no longer aligned with her understanding of herself. Any reaction that follows is simply a byproduct. And that distinction matters because it keeps her grounded. It prevents her from slipping back into old patterns of managing other people's perceptions or emotions. She's not responsible for how others process her absence. She's only responsible for maintaining her alignment. That's the standard. She operates by now, and once that standard is in place, it reshapes everything. Her relationships become more intentional. Her energy is invested where it's reciprocated. Her presence is no longer automatic, it's earned, sustained by mutual respect rather than expectation. There's a quiet strength in that, a kind of stability that doesn't need to be announced or defended. People can feel it, even if they can't articulate it. They recognize that access to her is no longer unconditional, and that recognition changes how they engage if they're capable of adjusting at all. And if they're not, the distance remains, not as punishment, but as alignment. Because at this stage, she understands something that took time to learn. You don't have to explain your absence to people who never questioned your presence. And once you understand that, you stop trying to make your exits comfortable for those who made your staying difficult. You simply leave and let the silence carry the message.